border town of San Miguel, baked under the relentless sun of July, 1881. Dust clung to every surface. Boots, hats, wagon wheels, even the wooden sign that creaked above the saloon. The main street smelled of horses and sweat, tobacco and desperation. It was a place where fortunes were gambled at poker tables and lost at the bottom of whiskey glasses, where cattlemen passed through chasing the next herd and drifters faded into alleys no one bothered to search. But today, the town square had filled with something else entirely. A stage had been built in front of the sheriff's office, rough planks nailed together, shaded only by a sagging canvas sheet. A handful of women stood on that stage, their dresses worn, their faces pale in the heat, while a man in a bowler hat called out prices with a booming voice meant to carry over the restless crowd. It was the monthly auction of mail-order brides, though few called it by that name. Out here on the edge of nowhere, families sold their daughters to men they hoped might give them a roof, and women desperate for escape bartered their freedom in exchange for survival. It was a cruel ritual, yet no one in San Miguel seemed surprised. Survival had always asked for its price. By the time the sun hung high overhead, all but one woman had been claimed. Some went for a few coins, others for promises scratched hastily on slips of paper. The crowd thinned until only a few dozen lingered, and the auctioneer's voice lost its easy swagger. She stood alone now. Her name was Clara Dawson, 22 years old, though her frame made her look younger. Her dress, once cream with small blue flowers, was torn at the hem and yellowed by travel. Dust streaked her cheeks where tears had dried, and her dark hair clung to her temples in the heat. She clutched her hands together at her waist, forcing herself to stand tall, though her shoulders trembled beneath the weight of too many eyes. "No takers?" The auctioneer barked, his patience thin. He waved his ledger like a flag. "Strong back, good with needle and thread, knows how to read? Who'll start me at $50? Silence spread. A group of ranchers leaned against the hitching post, muttering that she looked too frail to haul water or chop wood. Two miners spat into the dust and shook their heads. Even the saloon girls watching from the balcony whispered that this one wouldn't last a week on the frontier. Clara's throat tightened. She had prayed someone would see her worth. Someone who might offer her not comfort, not wealth, but simply the chance to begin again. She tried not to cry, but the sound of men turning away cut deeper than any insult. She was becoming invisible, and invisibility was a death sentence out here. 40 then? The auctioneer pushed, his voice sharp. 30? Lord above, gentlemen. She'll cook your meals and keep your house. Who's willing to spare a dime? Laughter rippled through the crowd, low and cruel. Clara lowered her head, shame burning hotter than the sun. That was when the murmur shifted. At the edge of the square, a tall man stepped forward from the shadows of the livery stable. He walked with a slight limp, his boot dragging just enough to mark him different from the other men. His hat brim was low, his coat patched at the elbows, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked as though the desert itself had carved him. Dry, worn, unfinished. This was Jacob Holt, 36 years old, though his eyes carried more years than his bones. Once, not long ago, he had owned a spread of land north of the Pecos, a cabin built with his own hands, and a wife who sang while hanging laundry in the wind. That life had gone to dust when fever took her and the child she carried. Since then, Jacob had wandered like a man without compass or anchor, living by odd jobs and whiskey, dragging his grief like a chain behind him. No one in San Miguel expected Jacob to speak, much less to buy. But he raised his hand. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, then seized the moment. "Well now, We've got 30 from Mr. Holt. Do I hear 35? No one answered. The town had seen Jacob's ruin, knew his pockets were as empty as his eyes. Sold, the auctioneer declared quickly, slapping the ledger shut. To Mr. Jacob Holt. Clara's breath caught. Relief and fear tangled in her chest. The man who had claimed her did not smile, did not nod with pride. He only stood there, weather-beaten and silent, as if raising his hand had cost him more than money. When she stepped down from the stage, her knees nearly buckled. Jacob offered no gallant gesture, no arm to steady her. He simply turned toward the hitching post where his horse waited, and she followed, because she had no other choice. The townsfolk muttered as they passed. Some pitied her, others scoffed. Last bride left, someone said, and she went to a broken man. They left San Miguel behind as the sun dipped westward. Jacob rode in silence, his jaw tight, while Clara clung to the saddle behind him, her heart pounding with every jolt of the trail. She wanted to ask where they were going, what kind of life awaited her, but the words tangled in her throat. She studied his back instead, the broad shoulders, the straight spine, the way he never once looked over to see if she was still there. Hours passed. The desert stretched endless, painted in gold and rust by the dying sun. At last they reached a small cabin tucked against a line of mesquite trees. The roof sagged, the fence leaned, and the well creaked with age. Chickens scattered as Jacob dismounted and tied his horse. "This is it," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Clara slid down, her legs stiff. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and loneliness. Inside, a single chair sat by the hearth, a table scarred by years of use, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Jacob lit a lamp, the flame flickering across his worn features. For the first time, Clara saw the lines around his eyes, carved by grief as much as by sun. "You can have the bed," he muttered. "I'll take the chair." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. She had expected harshness, maybe even cruelty. Instead, she found something stranger, a man who wanted nothing from her except distance. That night, as the wind howled outside and the lamp burned low, Clara lay awake on the thin mattress. She listened to the creak of the chair where Jacob sat, silent, staring into the dark. Two strangers bound not by love, not even by choice, but by the smallest act of mercy in a town that had offered none. And though she did not yet know it, that single raised hand at the auction had changed the course of both their lives forever. The days that followed unfolded in silence, as if words themselves had been left behind in San Miguel. Jacob spoke little, rising before dawn to tend the animals and split wood, his limp slowing but never stopping him. Clara tried to keep herself busy in the small cabin, sweeping dust from corners, patching the torn curtain, boiling beans with what little she could find in the pantry. Each task felt like a test, though he never commented on her efforts, never offered thanks or complaint. The air between them was heavy with things unspoken. At night, she lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while Jacob sat by the fire, his hat pulled low, a bottle at his side. She could hear the soft clink of glass as he drank, the occasional sigh that seemed dragged out of him against his will. Once, she woke in the small hours to find him still in the chair, head bowed, hands clenched around the empty bottle like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Clara understood grief, though not in the same measure. Her mother had died when she was 15, leaving her under the care of an uncle more interested in whiskey than kin. It was that uncle who had signed her name to the auction list, who had insisted that marriage to a stranger was better than starving in his shack. She had learned early that survival rarely came with kindness. Jacob, though, was different. He did not reach for her. did not treat her as property. If anything, he treated her like a ghost, present but untouchable. On the third morning, as she struggled with the pump at the well, he appeared beside her without a word. His hands closed over the handle, rough and scarred, and with one steady motion, water spilled into the bucket. She stepped back, startled, and he gave the faintest nod before carrying the bucket inside. It was the first time she'd seen him do something for her, unasked. Later, she tried to speak. "Do you want me to cook supper tonight?" He paused, then nodded once. "There's venison in the shed." It was not much, but it was a beginning. The cabin grew a rhythm after that. Jacob worked the land during the day, patching the fence, checking the traps, mending the roof. Clara followed where she could, offering small help, holding boards, threading needles through leather, gathering herbs along the creek. She burned her first loaf of bread, and when smoke filled the cabin, she braced for his anger. But Jacob only opened the window and said quietly, "Try again tomorrow." Each evening, they shared the same table. He ate little, she even less. But the silence between them shifted from sharp to something softer. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people learning how to exist without breaking each other's fragile edges. Still, the town's words haunted her. She remembered the laughter when no one bid, the pitying eyes that watched her step down from the stage. She feared that Jacob might regret raising his hand at all, that he might one day send her back or trade her for something more useful. One night, unable to bear it, she whispered, "Why me?" Jacob looked up from the fire, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought he might ignore her. Then he answered, his voice low, "Because no one else did." The words cut like a blade, but they were not cruel. They were simply the truth. Clara swallowed hard, her throat burning, but she did not press him further. She understood that sometimes survival came not from being chosen, but from being left behind until someone weary enough to see their own reflection reached out. As summer deepened, the land grew harsher. The well nearly ran dry, and Jacob spent hours digging deeper, sweat streaking his back, hands blistered raw. Clara brought him water, pressing the cup into his palm, watching as he drank without complaint. He never thanked her, but he didn't need to. The way he met her eyes for a fleeting second said enough. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, dark clouds swallowing the horizon. Rain hammered the roof, seeping through cracks, and the wind rattled the shutters like fists. Clara lit the lamp, its flame trembling, while Jacob stood at the door, watching the storm with his jaw clenched. She touched his arm without thinking, the first time she had dared. His muscles tensed beneath her fingers, but he did not pull away. "It will pass," she murmured. He turned then, and for the first time she saw the depth of his grief, carved into the lines around his eyes. He looked at her as though she were both a stranger and the only soul left on earth. When the storm broke at last, the world smelled of wet earth and pine. Clara sat awake long after Jacob had fallen asleep in his chair, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just the last bride left at the auction. She was someone who had chosen, however quietly, to stay. But in towns like San Miguel, secrets never stayed buried long. 2 weeks later, a rider came down the trail, a bounty hunter with cold eyes and a folded paper in his coat. He tied his horse to the post and knocked on the cabin door. Clara's blood ran cold. She had not told Jacob everything. She had not confessed that her uncle had sold her debts as well as her name, that men back east might still be searching for her. Jacob opened the door, his shoulders filling the frame. The bounty hunter tipped his hat, his smile thin. "I'm looking for a girl," he said. "Name's Clara Dawson. Heard she came this way." The silence that followed stretched like a wire ready to snap. Clara stood frozen in the shadows, her hands clenched, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the rain still dripping from the eaves. Jacob did not move, did not look back at her. He only said, in that low voice of his, "Ain't seen her." The bounty hunter's smile sharpened. "Funny, folks in town said different." Jacob stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, listening as the storm inside her heart rose higher than any thunder. For the first time since the auction, she realized, Jacob Holt might be broken, but he was also dangerous. And in that danger, she might find either salvation or ruin. Jacob stepped down from the porch and let the door ease shut. The bounty hunter stood with one hand on the hitch rail. His coat was salted with trail dust, his gaze small and measuring. Jacob kept his voice even. "Road runs two ways," he said. "Try the other." "Name's Pike," the man replied. "I track what's owed. Heard the girl ran from paper signed by kin. Paper travels. I follow." Jacob's jaw worked once, then stilled. Pike tried to peer past him through the window. Jacob moved and filled the view. "You want coffee?" Jacob asked. "Or you want the sheriff first?" Pike smiled without showing teeth. "I'll start with coffee." Daylight. They sat on the steps. Jacob kept his back to the door. The mug steamed between his palms. "She's worth money to the man who holds the notes," Pike said. "Not enough to hang, enough to make a ride." "Then ride," Jacob answered. "Thing is," Pike went on, "men who buy notes on kin buy stories too. The story says she lifts rings and leaves rooms sawed open. Says she's sweet as a hymn and slippery as oil." Jacob's mouth moved in what might pass for a smile. "Stories sold by men who sit while girls fetch kindling." Pike studied him. "You speak like a man with a stake." "I speak like a man who's had enough winter." Pike set the cup down and stood. "Sun up," he said. "I'll be back. Better to hand her to me than to the hands that ride behind me." Jacob did not answer. When the hoofbeats faded, he opened the door. Clara stood with her fingers dug into the table's rim, knuckles white. "I can go," she whispered. "If I leave now, he might lose the trail." Jacob shook his head. "You leave now, he reads fear and follows it. You stay and we give him something else to read." "What?" "Truth." He filled the lamp and set it between them. The small circle of light gentled the rough room. He sat slow from the bad leg and motioned to the other chair. She moved like someone waking after a fall. When she sat, her hands would not lie still. He waited. The clock on the shelf ticked toward a courage she had not yet spent. "My uncle sold the roof," she said at last. "Sold my mother's ring. Sold my name to a list that said bride and meant body. I ran from him and from the man who held the notes. I have stolen nothing but ours. The debt they claim is a rope they throw at any girl who says no." Jacob watched her while she spoke. "And the law?" he asked. "Does it know the rope is frayed?" "It knows," Clara said, "but it likes the rope better than the girl." He nodded once. "Then the law can listen to a different voice." "Whose?" "Mine." He reached for the coat on the peg. He checked the rifle, then set it back and took nothing but the coat. "Tomorrow we ride to San Miguel. We talk to Dobson. We talk where the street can hear. You would stand there, she asked, with me. I would stand, he said, because I can. At first light, they saddled the horses. The sky had the thin blue of new ice. They rode without speaking, and in the hush she felt the odd peace of motion, the way distance itself can become a prayer. San Miguel blinked awake as they came down the slope. Smoke lifted from low roofs. The smith's hammer rang once, then twice. Sheriff Dobson stood on the boardwalk with his thumbs in his belt. Pike leaned on a post 3 doors down, as if he had grown there. Jacob dismounted and offered Clara a hand. He did not let go when she took it. They climbed the steps together and faced the street. Dobson, Jacob said, you know me. I know your taxes pay and your temper keeps to your fence, Dobson answered. His eyes slid to Clara. You brought company. I brought my wife, Jacob said. And though the word surprised them both, he did not take it back. Men sell paper on her name. One man follows paper like a hound. I say the paper is a lie. Paper says debt, Pike called. Paper says take. Paper once said my brother owed a store he never entered. Jacob answered without looking at him. Paper said my father's brand belonged to a man with silk gloves. I've read enough paper to heat a winter. A small crowd formed in the spill of morning. Grocers, freighters, faces that had watched Clara the day she knelt by a refuse barrel and had said nothing. She felt her throat tighten, but held her place. Dobson chewed on a thought. You got proof the note is crooked. I got eyes, Jacob said. I got a woman who tells the same story each time because truth doesn't need new lines. I got a town that knows the seller drinks and the buyer smiles too much. Pike pushed off the post and sauntered closer. Truth pays less than ink. The man with the note sits in Santa Fe with doors that swing when he lifts a finger. Let him lift it, Jacob said. He can point it at me. Pike stopped, the space of 1 pace between them. Stand in the way and the money doubles. Men with colder hands will come. Jacob nodded. Then they can learn the road. Dobson raised a palm, choosing a plank and stepping onto it. We can bind this as a peace matter. Girl stays under protection until a judge reads the note. No one touches her. No one drags her. If the note is clean, the court says so. If it's foul, I say so. Pike weighed the crowd, the sheriff, the man who would not move. He tipped his hat. 2 weeks, he said. Then I ride again. He left the street to its breathing. The crowd loosened. Some folks nodded at Clara. Some could not meet her eyes. The bakery woman stepped forward and pressed a small paper bag into Clara's hands. Hot, she murmured. Eat while it's kind. Clara held the warm roll and felt heat creep back into her fingers. Jacob thanked the woman with a touch to his brim. They rode out while the town's noise returned. The wind shifted and carried the bite of snow off the peaks. Jacob rode a little ahead, then fell back. At the rim of the wash, he slowed and spoke without turning. I called you wife. You did. Do you want the word? He asked. Or do you want me to take it back? She let the reins slack and listened to the leather creak, to the soft chuff of her mare. I want the life that makes the word true. He nodded. Then we make it. They reached the cabin. Jacob lit the lamp and set a pot on the hook. After supper, he brought a small cedar box from a high shelf and set it on the table. Her name was Alma, he said. The name left a bruise in the air. She died in the year the river ran brown. I keep the little things because the big ones won't fit in a box. Clara looked at him. I cannot replace her. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm asking you to sit here now. When they rose, the house felt more like a place where two lives might learn how to talk. Days settled into waiting. Jacob cut posts and sank them clean. Clara mended, baked, learned the fence line. She read in the evenings while Jacob listened. Some nights he told small stories, simple as flat stones set in a creek. Hoofbeats rolled up the wash like distant thunder. Not Pike, not one horse. Many. Jacob set the cup down and reached for his coat. He looked at her, and the look was simple. "Whatever comes," he said, "you stand behind my shadow until it fits us both." She took his hand for one breath and let it go. The riders crested the rise, sun at their backs. Pike rode to the side, eyes flat as slate. The lead rider smiled without warmth. "We came for paper," he said. "We came for the girl." Jacob stepped off the porch and onto the hard yard. He stood square on the bad leg, as if he had just remembered it belonged to him. "You came for a fight," he said. "You might find one." The riders spread out across the yard, horses stamping, bits clinking in the cold air. Dust rose in faint spirals around their boots. Pike sat his mount off to the side, arms folded, eyes unreadable. The man at the front wore a black coat trimmed at the collar, his hat tilted low to shade a smile that looked practiced. He carried no rifle in sight, only a silver watch chain glinting against his vest. "You Holt?" the man asked. Jacob stood with both feet planted firm, shoulders square despite the limp that made him favor his right side. "Name's mine," he said. The man tipped his head. "Name's Carter. I speak for Mr. Calderon, who holds the note on that girl. He'd rather not make this messy. Hand her over, we ride back south, and you keep your skin." Clara gripped the edge of the doorway, her breath shallow. The cabin wall pressed cold against her back. She wanted to run, yet her legs locked as if the floor itself had claimed her. Jacob didn't blink. "You got words on paper. I've got words from her. I'll keep those." Carter's smile thinned. "You don't understand the measure here. This isn't about her hands sewing shirts or cooking beans. This is about a ledger. Calderon paid coin for a contract, and he intends to collect. You stand in the way, you stand against law, money, and men who don't forget." Jacob's jaw worked. Silent, then still. His voice when it came was steady. "I buried law once with my wife. I buried money when the river took my crop. Forgetting's the only thing a man like me has left, and I don't mind if it ends here." The words hung heavy. Carter studied him, then gave a small nod to one of his men. The rider eased forward, rifle resting casual across his lap. The click of the hammer carried like thunder. Clara stepped out before she could stop herself. "Enough," she cried, her voice cracking. Every eye turned. Her heart pounded, but she forced her chin up. "You want the truth? Then hear it from me. I took nothing. My uncle sold me like livestock. Calderon bought lies because that's what he deals in. If you drag me back, it won't be justice. It will be another chain for a woman who never owed him a dime." The yard stilled. Even Pike's gaze flickered, though he said nothing. Carter leaned back in his saddle, considering her. "Fine speech," he said softly. "But speeches don't pay debts." He turned his eyes to Jacob. "Last chance, Holt. Step aside." Jacob's hand rested on the butt of the revolver, holstered at his hip. "Last chance for you," he said. The standoff stretched long and brittle. Horses shifted, restless. A crow called from the mesquite, its cry cutting the silence. Then Pike moved. He spurred forward just enough to put his horse between Carter's men in the cabin. His voice was low but carried. "I've tracked thieves and killers for 20 years, seen liars spin tales prettier than hymns. But I've watched this girl in quiet. Truth don't twitch like a lie does. I say Calderon's paper isn't worth the dust it's written on. Carter turned, eyes narrowing. You switch sides now, Pike? You know what Calderon pays for loyalty. More than what's left of my soul, Pike muttered. He looked at Jacob. But a man has to sleep at night. I'll not drag her back. The moment shattered. Carter cursed and wheeled his horse. Then you both just signed your graves, he snapped. He signaled, and his men pulled rein. This isn't finished. Calderon doesn't lose. They rode off in a spray of dust, their silhouettes swallowed by the ridge. Only Pike lingered a moment longer. He tipped his hat to Jacob, then to Clara. Keep watch, he said. They'll come again. Then he spurred his horse and vanished down the trail. Silence fell heavy over the yard. Jacob exhaled slow, the tension leaving him in one sharp breath. Clara stepped closer, her knees weak. You shouldn't have stood in front of me, she whispered. I told you, he answered. Whatever comes, you stand behind my shadow. Her eyes filled, but she swallowed the tears. She touched his arm, just lightly, and he let her hand stay there. It was the first time since San Miguel that touch felt like trust and not trespass. That night, the cabin glowed with lamplight against the dark. Jacob sat by the fire, the revolver cleaned and laid on the table beside him. Clara sat across, needle moving through fabric, patching the worn quilt. Neither spoke much, but the silence was no longer empty. It was alive, carrying something fragile between them. When she finally lifted her eyes, she said, You called me, wife. He looked at her for a long time. I did. You meant it? He nodded once. I did. Her hands trembled, but her voice steadied. Then let me be it. The words settled like stones in a riverbed, changing its flow forever. Jacob reached across the table, rough fingers closing gently around hers. For the first time since Alma's grave, he allowed himself to hold on. Outside, the wind swept over the plains, carrying away the dust of threats not yet gone. But inside, beneath the flicker of the lamp, a broken cowboy and the last bride of an auction began to piece together something neither had expected to find again. Hope. Dawn came without color. A gray band lifted off the plains and left the world the way trouble leaves a bruise. Jacob saddled both horses and checked the cinches twice. Clara set coffee on the stove and laid out dried apples and a heel of bread. Neither spoke of the riders, yet both listened for hooves. When the sun finally cleared the ridge, the day felt borrowed, like it might be taken back without warning. By noon, Jacob had repaired the south fence and stacked a rack of kindling near the porch. Clara swept the cabin and aired the bedding, then stood in the doorway with a blanket over her shoulders. The land rolled away in long breaths, pale grass bending to a steady wind. It should have felt like freedom. It felt like a straight road with no turnoffs. Pike came just before evening. He rode slow, dust heavy on his coat, hat low, eyes scanning every cut in the land. He dismounted without tying off, a man ready to move again in the same motion. Jacob handed him a tin cup, and he drank, not with thirst, but with duty. They'll try the law first, Pike said. A marshal from the railhead and a paper with a courthouse stamp. If that fails, they'll try the dark. Fires start easy in wind like this. Men vanish. You'll need folk to see you plain when it counts. Folk don't climb this far unless they want something, Jacob said. Then give them something to want, Pike answered. He turned to Clara. You wrote your truth once and lost it to a thief. Write it again where thieves can't reach. That night, Clara sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a scrap of smooth brown paper saved from flour sacks. She wrote slow. Her hand shook at first, then steadied. She told of the auction and the room that smelled of lard and smoke. She told of the ledger with her name marked beside a number, of the carriage and the man who pinched her wrist like testing fruit, of the cut on her finger and the blood on the contract. She told of running, not for freedom only, but for breath, and of a horse that carried her north and a cowboy who fed her in silence. She signed her full name and folded the page like a prayer. At first light, Jacob and Pike rode to town. Clara watched until they were specks, then smoke, then nothing. She set water to boil and chopped onions and pressed her palm to the cool window. Alone again, yet not the same kind of alone. Their horses returned at dusk. Jacob slid from the saddle and gathered her into his arms without a word. His coat smelled of dust and courthouse ink. Pike stayed back, hat in his hands, a shape cut from twilight. "The judge read your page," Jacob said softly. "He said ink is weight when a community decides to lift it. Sheriff Dobson posted a notice at the square. Any claim on your body has to be proven in open light. No more backroom papers." Clara felt her knees weaken with relief. It did not wash her clean, but it took the grit off her teeth. Pike's mouth twitched. Carter saw it too. He rode out with tight shoulders. Calderon won't enjoy hearing the plains decided against him. Men like him kick when they lose ground. Be ready. They were. For 3 days the wind held steady, and the sky stayed flat. Jacob worked the line to the north, and Clara mended and cooked and carried water with the walk of someone who had found the pace of a place. Pike watched the horizon and slept on the porch with his coat over his eyes and his hand near his gun. At night, Clara read aloud from a tattered almanac, and Jacob listened like each season was a psalm. Trouble came on the 4th night. The air smelled wrong, bitter and hot. Clara woke first to a low crackle that did not belong to the stove. She pushed up the shutter and saw a tongue of light licking the grass at the far end of the yard. Another spark caught near the corral, then another beyond the woodpile. Someone had walked a half circle and shaken fire like seed. Jacob was already at the door, boots half-laced. Pike rolled off the porch and ran for the well. Clara grabbed the wool blanket from the bed and plunged it into the wash barrel, then dragged it through the dirt, heavy and dripping. The first flame reached the stack of dry chaff and jumped taller than a man. Heat rushed like a held breath released. They did not shout. They moved. Pike beat at the nearest blaze with a wet sack. Jacob swung a shovel, throwing black dirt in a steady arc. Clara hauled and doused and hauled again until her shoulders burned and the blanket left a trail across her palms. Sparks landed on her hair and hissed out. Smoke clawed at her throat. The world shrank to orange and heat and the rhythm of work. Hooves sounded on the ridge. Carter rode in with 3 men, rifles slung, faces hidden in the flare. He drew up short when he saw them standing in the firelight, not running, not crying, just refusing to vanish. He looked almost sorry for a blink, then his jaw set. "Best to stand back," he called. "Flames don't sign notices." Pike straightened, soot streaking his face like war paint. "Put that torch down," he said. "You cross one more fence line, and you'll need a preacher, not a lawyer." Carter's smile was tired. "I could call this an accident." He flicked the torch in his hand, and the flame leapt. He never finished the motion. A shotgun cracked from the dark beyond the corral, and the torch flew like a comet and died in the dirt. Figures stepped into view, lanterns bobbing, coats thrown over nightshirts. Sheriff Dobson led 3 ranchers and the widow from the low creek and Mrs. Delaney with her shawl tight and her chin higher than it had ever been. Behind them came the blacksmith, 2 cowhands from the crossing, and the stable boy from town who had once left a heel of bread behind a barrel. "Evening," the sheriff said, voice calm. "We saw the glow from the ridge. That notice in the square made us neighbors tonight." He leveled his shotgun with the ease of a man who uses it for coyotes and cow thieves the same. "Town says this yard is watched." Carter looked from the crowd to the flames to Clara with a wet blanket in her hands. For the first time, his practiced smile slipped. He held up his empty palm like the trick was over. "Message received," he said. He turned his horse. "Calderon will have his say in a bigger room." "Then he can buy a ticket," the sheriff replied. He stepped forward. "You ride out now, and if any more lights dance on this prairie, I'll call it murder and set a posse." Carter studied the faces, smudged with smoke, eyes fierce in the lantern glare. He did not see a courtroom. He saw a threshing floor and men who refused to leave a woman to burn. He touched his brim to Clara, perhaps from habit, perhaps from respect, then wheeled his horse and disappeared with his men down the draw. The fire died by inches. Water hissed, dirt smothered, clothing steamed in the cooling air. When at last only embers pulsed in the blackened grass, the small crowd stood in a loose ring, breathing hard. No one cheered. They watched the last sparks like watchers at a bedside. Then one by one they nodded and turned home. Mrs. Delaney pressed a tin of salve into Clara's blackened hands and squeezed hard enough to be felt through the ash. The sheriff touched his hat to Jacob and Pike both. "Your notice holds," he said. "Long as we do." The yard emptied. Pike leaned on the shovel, chest heaving, then laughed once without humor. "Never thought I'd see it. A town choose light over ledger." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "Calderon won't ride in person now. He'll buy a judge or a newspaper. He'll bury you with words. You ready for that kind of storm?" Jacob glanced at Clara. She stood swaying, soot on her cheek like a stripe, hair damp, eyes steady. He reached out and rested his hand at the small of her back. "We're ready," he said. Together. The next week turned clear and keen. Jacob cut a fire break and moved the woodpile and hung a second bucket by the well. Pike took the south trail and came back with word that Carter had gone east. The sheriff posted another sheet in the square. Any claim against Clara would be heard under the cottonwood at noon on Saturday with the town as witness. Not a courtroom with velvet, but a place where wind and sun could wash every word. When the day came, they rode in early. The cottonwood spread its shade like a sail. Benches had been carried from the church. Folks filled them without whispering. The judge from Cheyenne did not come, though rumor said he had been invited. The sheriff stood with a ledger on his knee. Pike leaned against a post, quiet as a fence post, but with eyes that missed nothing. Carter arrived near midday, with a man in a narrow coat who carried a leather case and spoke as if language were a net only he could cast. He produced papers and seals and letters with signatures that had twined themselves into knots. He spoke of contracts and claims and the sanctity of agreements. He did not speak of a cut on a finger or a girl in a room with no way out but a window. When he finished, the sheriff nodded and turned to Clara. "You have the floor," he said. She did not raise her voice. She told it again, the way she had written it, the way it had burned in her bones. The room where men laughed, the heat, the pinch on her wrist, the blood that was not consent, the ride north and the way a stranger handed her bread without asking her price. She did not weep. She let stillness do the work between sentences. When she finished, Pike spoke one line. "I saw her the day after. You can tell the shape of a lie by how it tries to move. She did not move like that. Mrs. Delaney told of her daughter's fever and the hand that held a cup steady through the night. The blacksmith spoke of a colt saved at dawn. The widow spoke of a loaf left on her step when her pantry had gone to echo. None of it was law as printed in books, yet every word rested where the town could weigh it. The sheriff closed the ledger and looked at Carter. "Paper says one thing," he said. "The people living under this sky say another. I rule for the sky I breathe." He placed Clara's written page on top of the bounty notice, pressed them together, and tore them in half. The sound was small and final. Carter stood very still, then nodded once like a man marking a loss. He did not reach for his pistol. He did not spit. He closed his case and left. The town did not clap. They simply stood and let the wind carry the last loose ash out over the flats. Pike lingered at the edge of the shade. He looked older in good light, as if the fire had burned smoke out of him. "My trail splits here," he said. "You found what I never did. A place to stop. Keep it." He mounted slow, then smiled with only his eyes. "Then get married proper, or folks will keep bringing you casseroles and talking behind their hands." Jacob laughed, the sound rusty but true. "Stay for the supper," he said. "Different road," Pike answered, tipping his hat. He rode out without turning back. Some men only know how to keep moving. The gift is to bless what they leave. They married under the same cottonwood a week later, not because they needed the town's eyes, but because they wanted the town's blessing. The sheriff said the words. Mrs. Delaney held a bouquet of prairie flowers tied with twine. The widow baked a pie that tasted like childhood. Jacob took Clara's hands and promised to keep her safe without caging her, to guard her name without owning it, to share his silence and his storms. Clara promised to keep the fire lit and the stories honest, to plant rows straight and forgive crooked days, to stay when staying would be work and not only comfort. They did not kiss to applause. They leaned their foreheads together and let the breeze do the rest. When they rode home, the sun had already begun to lean west, casting long shadows that walked beside them like good companions. Years later, a traveler would ride the ridge and see the same cabin, gray and sound. He would hear a child laughing near the corral and a woman singing something that did not quite have a melody, but felt like mourning. He would pass a wooden sign over the gate, letters carved deep by a careful hand. It would not say Holt Ranch or anything grand. It would say simply, bread was offered, and a family began. If he asked in town who lived there, someone would speak their names in the easy tone used for neighbors. If he asked what had happened to the auction girl and the broken cowboy, a few would smile and point south to the cottonwood where dust still held a memory of vows. One or two would mention a night when the prairie glowed and a line held. None would mention Calderon. Men like him fade with the ink they buy. What remains are the small bright acts that make a place a home. And in the cabin, when the wind came low and the lamp burned soft, Jacob would sit with his back easy, and Clara would read aloud, not from law but from weather and seed and the names of stars. Their lives would not be grand. They would be steady, which is a better word. They would argue sometimes about fences and salt and how much flour to keep through winter. They would forgive before dawn. In spring they would plant, and in fall they would stack hay in sound squares, and through every season they would return to the same door and the same fire and the same shared shadow. He had raised his hand once, not to buy, but to choose. She had lifted her voice once, not to beg, but to be seen. Between those two small, brave motions, a life took root, with room enough for others to stand inside it and feel the weather ease.